Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to start to look at some of the more advanced aspects of forms in Access 2013. And in this first section itself I'm going to do a quick review of some of the basics of forms, but within that I'm going to introduce you to one or two things that you may well not have seen before, a couple of tips and tricks that will help you to develop more sophisticated Access applications and to be more efficient in the way that you do it. So let's get started. I'm going to demonstrate many of the features of forms using this college student database that you've seen a few times already. Now, although I'll be talking about quite a bit of the form code and the forms themselves in detail, it may be useful to you to be able to access that code itself. If you actually create a new database, then one of the standard templates that you can use is the desktop student database. Click on that to create a new database. And that new database contains most of the features that I'm going to be talking about over the next few sections. Now, to be fair, the student database that I'll be using has a little bit more in it. Apart from having quite a bit of data in it, a few forms and a few features have been added, so it's not all included. But basically what you need is within that database, so you can create one of those databases yourself and you can use that to follow along with the examples that I'll be using. And don't forget, if you create one of those new databases, click on Enable Content to trust that database, and then once you've trusted it, you won't get those messages any longer. Now, what I want to do first of all is to just choose one of the forms within this database. I'm going to choose the student list form, and I'm going to go into Design View and talk about some basic aspects of the design of forms. Now, first of all, as you can see here, this form has a header, it has a details section, and the footer is empty. Now, of course, a form can have a number of detail sections. It can have headers and footers. We're going to talk about headers and footers a little bit more later on, but for this particular case, what I want to do is to concentrate on the property sheet for the whole form. So don't forget, I've got a drop down here listing all of the objects. I've got the form footer, the form header, and so on. But I want to look at the whole form at the moment. Now, one of the very important aspects of any form is its record source. And the record source can be a table, it can be a query, and as a query it can either be a query, such as in this case students extended, or you can actually put in there an SQL statement, a SQL statement. In this case, it's actually a query that's used for this form. So I'm currently looking at the form design tools, and on the design tab, having established that this particular form is bound to the query students extended, on the design tab there is a button in the tools group there, add existing fields. Let me just close the property sheet. Click on Add Existing Fields, and the field list lists all of the fields that are available because this form is bound to the Students Extended query. And I can go to any field on this list and very simply add it to the form. So one of the most critical things with any form is which table or query the form is bound to. If a form is not bound to any table or query, then in effect the field list will be empty and there will be no fields from any records or queries inherently available to that form. You can, however, add those fields to the form, but then in order to actually capture that data, for example to get a particular value of a particular field from a particular record in a table, then you'll need to write some code in order to get that data to put on the form. And similarly, if you add or change any data, you'll need to write some code to store it in one or more tables. So to create a form, normally what you do is select a table or query. Let's suppose I select here the query Guardians Extended, go to the Create tab. Then the options for forms are to create a form, to go into form design, create a blank form, to use the form wizard, or on the more forms drop down we have the options of multiple items, datasheet, split form, modal dialog. or we have one of the varieties of navigation form. Now I'm going to assume that you've used pretty much all of these before and you're familiar with the differences between them, but just want to point out one or two quite important things. First of all, if you go into Form, having selected a query, what you basically get is a form in Form View, and then you have the field list populated on the right. If you actually go into Form View for this, so we actually open this form up, then it's basically a form that's ready to use. It's laid out here in two columns, and then we have on the left the record selector. I'll talk about the record selector in a moment, and down at the bottom we have a set of navigation buttons that let us step through the records in the table, including going to the first record or going to the last record. A little button there, which is the one we click for a new record. And then we also have a filter button, and we have a search box, and I'll talk about all of those a little bit later on. Now that pretty much showed you one of the options when you're creating a new form from, in this case, a selected query, and then you could decide exactly which fields you wanted, you could rearrange them, you could format it, and so on. In order to demonstrate the next point, I'm going to go back into the student database with data in it, because we're going to need some data for some of the next points. So let me again go into Guardian Extended. Let me create a new form, exactly the same that we did just now, but with some data. There's the form, but note now you can actually see some data. Now let me go into Design View. And then I'm going to go to the Property sheet, which is on the Design tab. I'm going to go to the Format tab, select the form, and I'm going to allow Datasheet View yes. By default it's not allowed. Let me close that, and now let me switch to Datasheet View. Now in Datasheet View, what I see is a list of the Guardians. That's straightforward enough, but amongst the things that you can see with this list is the record selector on the left. Now the record selector is very useful for selecting individual Guardians, of course, if you want to do something else to them or get some more information about them. But if I go back to Form View, the record selector doesn't actually perform any useful function in Form View. So let's see how to get rid of that, because it's just a bit of a distraction really to have that selector there. So let's go back into Design View. Let's bring up the Property sheet again for the form, and then down here, Record Selectors, let's change that to No. Again, let's close the sheet for the moment. Let's go back into Form View. No record selector. Of course, back in Datasheet View, we still have a record selector. Now let's suppose that in the process of designing a form such as this one, you've set out all of your fields either automatically using one of the standard create options or using the wizard, and you decide that in a particular case, let's suppose the country region field here, which has been set up as a text box, you actually want to change it to be a combo box so that users can either select from a list of countries or maybe type their own country in. You can actually morph controls on a form in Access 2013. So let's go back into Design View. Let's go to the Country Region box here. Right click on it, and one of the options when you right click is Change To. And if you click on Change To on a control, it offers you the alternatives for that particular control. Now in this case, if I wanted to change it to a combo box, for example, click on Combo Box and it's automatically changed for you. Now, you may still have the setup to do, of course, in terms of populating the combo box for what the available options are, but the actual changing of the nature of the control is done for you automatically by Access 2013, which is pretty useful when you're partway through developing or using an application and you decide that you've used the wrong sort of control somewhere. Now, apart from morphing a control, another thing that can be really quite time consuming is when you've created a particular form, say this one, pretty automatically, and you've got what are primarily text boxes on it. Let's suppose that you go to the state province text box and you decide you're going to do a bit of formatting on that. Of course, within the form design tools, you have the design tab. You have the Arrange tab, which will enable you to do things like positioning controls and working with tabular layouts and so on. And then you have the actual formatting buttons that enable you, if you like, to color a lot of things in. Well, let's suppose that you go to something like this state province box here and you say, well, actually I want to put a different shape fill on that. I want to use that shape fill, and for the outline color I'm going to use, let's choose something a little bit silly, let's go for that. And you maybe do some other things there. In that particular control you decide that the text is going to be 14 point or something like that. Having made those changes, you then think, right, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do the same in that field and that field and that field. Well, you can use the Format Painter. So with that field selected, the State Province field, if you click on the Format Painter, you can then change any of the other fields to have the same format settings with a single click like that. If you want to do this to a number of fields, if you again go back to the original one to select it, double click on the Format Painter, then it will stay sticky. You can use it in a number of different places, and then you just click on the Format Painter when you've finished. So let's see how that now looks in Form View, and we'll see how those four fields are all different and we haven't had to go through the same repetitive formatting. And here's something else that can be a real time saver. Let's suppose that you're putting some buttons onto a form. I've left a bit of space on this form here, so go into the Design tab and I'm going to put a number of command buttons on here. It doesn't really matter what sort of controls, but let's use command buttons as an example. So I select that, I draw a command button. Let me get rid of the field list for the moment. Let's bring up the property sheet for that command button. And for that command button, which is actually command 128, I decide that I'm going to change the font size from 11 to 14. And I'm going to change the alignment, let's do something really quite strange, to left. And I make a number of decisions about how to format this command button. And then I say, okay, well, I'm going to have 5 or 6 other command buttons on this form, or other forms as well. And I really want to use that style throughout. Now, you've just seen how to use the Format Painter, but there is another way of doing it, and that is to reset the default style of command buttons. Now, if I select away from that particular command button, the one that I've just added, and go up here to the controls and select there, you'll see in the property sheet that the selection is default command button. So if I now go through and make those same changes, so I'm going to change that from 11 to 14, and I'm going to change the alignment from center to left. I realize these are probably quite strange changes, and I say, yep, that's fine. Now, when I'm working in Design View and I want to add another command button, then by default I get that larger font and the left aligned text on the button. Now, you can do that with pretty much all of these controls and pretty much all of the formats available to them. So changing the default is also a real time saver. And there's just one other thing that I'd like to look at in general, and in the next section we're going to move on to some more specific things, and that is that if I look at the properties of command 128, that command button that I just added to the form, on the Other tab there's a pair of properties, Default and Cancel. And if a command button has the Yes default property, then that means that that is the default button. And if the user presses the Enter key anywhere on the form, then the effect of pressing the Enter key is the same as clicking this command button. Now, only one button can have this property, obviously, on a form. If two could, then it would get very confusing. But if you want a default action on a form, that's the property you need to set. Similarly, one button and one button only can have the cancel property. So command 129, for instance, could be given the cancel yes property, and that means that that's the same as pressing the escape key, as basically doing a cancel anywhere on the form. And in fact, if I went into form view on this particular one, let me just go into form view. Pressing enter is the same as pressing command 128. Doesn't actually do anything at the moment. I haven't given it the code to do anything. And pressing the escape key is the equivalent of pressing command 129. With both of those, you may just have seen the buttons getting selected there. So that's an important couple of properties to know about as well. So that's our coverage of the general points at the moment. There will be a couple more later on. In the next section, I'm going to concentrate on looking at some specific features of a specific type of form in Access 2013. So please join me for that.